The cold didn't kill you right away. First, it stripped you of your dignity. Then, it took your memories. When Nora realized the wagon tracks were gone, erased by the driving sleet, she didn't scream. She just stared at the half-gathered bundle of wet kindling in her bruised hands. Her family hadn't lost her. They had subtracted her. This is the story of a woman left to rot in the high timber, and the brutal, silent man who pulled her from the frost. The mud of the trail had already begun to freeze, turning the deep ruts left by the wagon wheels into sharp, treacherous ridges. Nora stood at the edge of the tree line, a bundle of damp pine branches clutched to her chest. The coarse wool of her coat scratched at her throat. Her breath plumed in the fading light, harsh and ragged. She stared down the trail. It was empty, just a long, winding scar through the pines, disappearing into the heavy grey fog settling over the mountain pass. 30 minutes ago, she had stepped off the trail to gather firewood. Her father had barked the order without looking at her, his eyes fixed nervously on the darkening sky. "Get some dry wood, Nora. Be quick about it." She had been quick, or as quick as she could be, with the lingering ache in her left hip from the damp. But when she pushed her way back through the dense underbrush, the wagon was gone. The oxen, her mother, her 3 younger brothers. Gone. At first, she felt nothing but a dull confusion. A mistake. They had rounded the bend and hadn't realized she wasn't walking behind the tailgate. She dropped the wood. The branches clattered loudly in the profound, suffocating silence of the forest. She began to walk. Then she began to jog, her boots slipping on the icy mud. "Pah!" Her voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the vastness of the trees. It didn't echo. "Ma!" She ran until her lungs burned, a sharp, metallic taste filling the back of her throat. She rounded the bend. The trail stretched on, empty, climbing higher into the pass. And there, pressed deeply into a patch of soft earth just before the rock line, were the distinct, hurried marks of the oxen breaking into a trot. They had sped up. Nora stopped. The wind picked up, biting through her thin skirt, chilling the sweat on her back. She looked down at the tracks. The truth settled into her stomach like a swallow of lead. It wasn't a mistake. It was arithmetic. 6 mouths, a half-barrel of flour, a mountain pass that was already spitting snow 2 weeks before November. The oxen were starving. The wagon was too heavy. They needed to move faster, and she was the slowest. She was 22, unmarried, useless with a rifle, and carried a limp when the weather turned cold. She was dead weight. A sharp, ugly sound tore out of her throat. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of an animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. She fell to her knees in the freezing mud, her fingers digging into the rut left by the iron-rimmed wheel. She hated them. She wanted them to freeze. She wanted the axle to snap. But beneath the vicious flare of hatred, a cold, pathetic terror took hold. She was entirely alone. The first night, she didn't sleep. She crawled under the root system of a massive, overturned spruce. The earth smelled of rot and ancient dust. She pulled her knees to her chest, shivering so violently her teeth chipped against each other. The darkness was absolute. The woods came alive with sounds. The snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. The distant low moan of the wind sounded like breathing. She clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her dirty face, mixing with the snot running from her nose. She didn't want to die. She prayed, then she cursed, then she just whimpered, a low, continuous sound of absolute misery. By the morning of the second day, the hunger stopped being an ache and became a violent, gnawing rat in her belly. She tried to eat a handful of snow, but it only lowered her body temperature, sending her into a fresh fit of convulsions. She found a few withered berries on a bush and chewed them. They tasted like ash and made her vomit up strings of bitter yellow bile. The snow began to fall in earnest by noon. Thick, heavy flakes that stuck to her hair and eyelashes. She kept walking. She didn't know where. Just forward. If she stopped, she would die. She dragged her left leg. Her boots were soaked through, her toes numb wooden blocks. The landscape lost its color, blurring into a smear of gray and white. The wind howled, a physical force pushing against her chest. She tripped over a submerged root and went down hard, her cheek striking a stone. The skin split. She felt the warm, slow trickle of blood. But no pain. Just a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She pushed herself up on her hands, her arms shaking. Just get up, she told herself. She couldn't. Her muscles simply refused to fire. The earth beneath her felt suddenly, seductively soft. The biting cold was receding, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth. It felt nice, like sinking into a feather bed after a long day of chores. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Just rest a minute. Nora closed her eyes. The wind sounded like her mother, humming. The snow piled rapidly against her back, burying the dark wool of her coat. The arithmetic of the trail had balanced. The warmth was a lie, but it was a comfortable one. Nora floated in a heavy, dark place, entirely disconnected from the meat and bones of her body. Then a smell punctured the void. It wasn't a pleasant smell. It was harsh. Wet animal fur, rancid grease, old blood and wood smoke. It cut through the sweet, numb fog in her brain like a rusted knife. Something rough and wet dragged across her face. A tongue. Nora groaned. The sound was pathetic, barely a rasp. She forced her heavy eyelids open. The grey sky was blocked by a massive, terrifying shape. A wolf. Its breath blew hot and foul over her cheek. She tried to flinch, tried to raise a hand to protect her throat, but her arm wouldn't obey. Off, Brutus. The voice was like two stones grinding together, deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of urgency. The wolf thing backed away, revealing itself to be a dog, a monstrous, scarred hound with yellow eyes. Behind the dog stood a man. He blotted out the light. He wore a coat stitched together from varied, mismatched hides, the fur turned inward. His face was a map of deep lines and weather-beaten leather, mostly hidden behind a thick, untrimmed beard the color of dirty straw. A rifle rested casually across his broad shoulder. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fallen tree across his path. An obstacle. A curiosity. Nora wanted to speak. She wanted to say, "Help me." Her lips moved, cracking the frozen blood on her cheek, but only a dry hiss came out. The man knelt. He smelled overwhelmingly of pine tar and unwashed humanity. He reached out with a massive hand, clad in a greasy leather glove, and grabbed the lapel of her coat. He didn't check her pulse. He didn't ask her name. He just heaved. The sudden movement tore Nora from her numb cocoon. Agony exploded through her frozen joints. She screamed, a ragged, breathless sound, as he hauled her upright. Her legs crumpled instantly. She pitched forward against his chest. It was like hitting a brick wall covered in fur. "Ain't dead yet," he muttered. It was a statement of fact, not relief. He didn't carry her like a bride. He bent down, jammed his shoulder into her stomach, and stood up, hauling her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The air rushed out of her lungs. Her head bounced painfully against his back with every step he took. The blood rushed to her brain, bringing a sickening wave of vertigo. Through the dizzying sway, she saw the hound trotting behind them, and beyond that, the massive, dark shape of a horse standing patiently in the snow. He threw her over the saddle. Her stomach slammed against the stiff leather. "Hold on," he commanded. He didn't wait to see if she could. He swung up behind her, grabbing the reins. His arm acted as a crude iron bar across her back, pinning her in place. He clicked his tongue, and the horse lurched forward. The ride was a blur of torture. Every step of the horse sent a jarring shockwave through her frozen limbs. The cold wind bit into her again, reawakening the agony in her hands and feet. She faded in and out of consciousness. She remembered vomiting, a dry, painful heaving over the side of the horse. The man didn't stop. He just shifted his arm to let her retch, entirely unfazed. When she finally opened her eyes again, the snow was falling in a blinding sheet. The horse had stopped. The man slid off the saddle. He reached up and dragged her down. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed into the snow at his feet. He swore softly, a low rumble in his chest, then scooped her up under the arms and dragged her through the drifts. A heavy wooden door creaked open. The transition from the freezing void to the interior was shocking. The air inside hit her like a physical blow, thick, stiflingly hot, and smelling of cured meat, ash, and old sweat. He dropped her onto something hard, a cot. The mattress was stuffed with crackling corn husks. Nora lay there, gasping, her eyes rolling back in her head. The man moved around the small space with heavy, deliberate steps. He threw a log into an open iron stove, the flames illuminating the low-ceilinged room in erratic flashes of orange light. Then he turned to her. He held a hunting knife. Nora's heart gave a weak, terrified flutter. She tried to scramble backward, but her body was a block of ice. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blade. Instead, she felt the knife slide down her leg. A sharp tug. He was cutting her boots off. The leather had frozen solid to her wool stockings. He didn't bother untying them. He just sliced down the side, peeling the stiff leather away from her ruined feet. He stripped her of her outer coat, then her wet shawl. He left her in her underdress, a damp, filthy layer of cotton. He didn't look at her with lust, or even mild interest. He worked with the detached efficiency of a butcher dressing a carcass. He grabbed a heavy, coarse wool blanket and threw it over her. Then came the pain. As the heat of the cabin began to penetrate her frozen flesh, the numbness broke. It didn't tingle. It burned. It felt like her fingers and toes were being held over an open flame. Nora writhed on the cot, a high, thin wail tearing from her throat. She thrashed, kicking her legs, trying to escape the agonizing thaw. The man stepped forward. He put one massive hand on her chest and pinned her down flat against the cot. "Hold still," he grunted, "or you'll break something." He held her there effortlessly while she screamed and sobbed, her tears soaking into the rough ticking of the mattress. She hated him for the heat, hated him for the pain, hated him for keeping her alive to feel it. He watched her thrash with dead, calm eyes until the worst of the agony subsided into a dull, throbbing burn, and exhaustion dragged her down into darkness. When Nora woke, the cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the wood stove and the rhythmic, wet sound of the hound chewing on a bone in the corner. Her mouth tasted like copper and dirt. She tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed in protest. Her hands, resting on top of the scratchy blanket, were swollen tight, the skin a bruised, angry purple. But she could feel them. She curled her fingers. Pain shot up her forearms, but they moved. She wasn't going to lose them. She turned her head slowly. The cabin was a single, cramped room. Logs chinked with mud. The roof was low, blackened by years of smoke. Tools, traps, and dried animal pelts hung from pegs driven into the wood. A crude table sat in the center, scattered with gun parts and oily rags. The man was sitting on a three-legged stool near the fire. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements slow and methodical. Without the heavy hide coat, he looked leaner, but no less intimidating. His forearms, exposed by a rolled-up flannel shirt, were corded with muscle and crisscrossed with faded white scars. He didn't look up, but he spoke. "You're awake." His voice was flat. No inquiry. No, "How do you feel?" "Water," Nora croaked. It sounded like paper tearing. He set the rifle down. He stood, grabbed a tin cup from a shelf, and dipped it into a bucket near the door. He walked over to the cot and held it out. Nora tried to reach for it, but her swollen fingers fumbled against the tin. The cup slipped. Water splashed onto the blanket. The man sighed, a sound of profound annoyance. He sat on the edge of the cot. The wood groaned under his weight. He slid a calloused hand behind her neck, lifting her head roughly, and pressed the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, the water cold and tasting heavily of iron. She coughed, water dribbling down her chin. He lowered her back down and stepped away. "Who left you?" he asked. He returned to his stool and picked up his rifle. Nora swallowed, the memory of the empty trail hitting her like a physical punch to the gut. She looked up at the ceiling. She didn't want to cry in front of this man. She swallowed hard, forcing the lump in her throat down. "My family," she said, her voice shaking. The man didn't pause his oiling of the gun barrel. "Why?" "Too many mouths. Not enough food. The wagon was heavy." She stated it plainly. "The arithmetic." He grunted. "Smart." Nora flinched. The blunt cruelty of the word shocked her. She looked at him, searching his face for a joke, a sneer. There was none. He was simply acknowledging the brutal logic of the mountains. A sick, crippled animal is left behind, so the herd survives. "I'm Nora," she said, a desperate attempt to assert her humanity. "Judson," he replied, not looking up. "Folks call me Judd, though ain't many folks up here." For the next 4 days, Nora did not leave the cot. Judd operated around her as if she were a piece of furniture. He fed her bitter willow bark tea to bring down her fever, and force fed her a greasy, tasteless stew made from rabbit and dried roots. When she needed the chamber pot, he simply shoved it under the cot and stepped outside, leaving the door cracked open to the freezing wind until she was done. There was no modesty. There was no dignity. There was only survival. By the 5th day, the swelling in her hands had gone down. She could stand, though her left hip throbbed violently, and her toes felt like they were wrapped in stinging nettles. She stood by the small, cloudy window, watching Judd split wood outside. The axe rose and fell with terrifying power, splitting massive rounds of pine with a single, echoing thwack. He moved like an engine, cold, precise, relentless. Nora looked down at her hands. She was alive, but a cold, sinking realization settled over her. Where was she supposed to go? Winter was here. The snow outside was already waist-deep in the drifts. The nearest town was likely weeks away on foot across impassable mountains. Her family was gone. She had no money, no boots, no coat. She was trapped in a 10-by-10 box with a man who looked like he could snap her neck as easily as he snapped kindling. The door banged open. The hound trotted in, bringing a flurry of snow. Judd followed, carrying an armful of wood. He dumped it unceremoniously into the wood box. He kicked the door shut, stomping his boots. He looked at her standing by the window. His pale eyes scanned her up and down, not appraising her body, but assessing her utility. "You can walk," he said. "Yes," Nora said, her voice small. Judd pointed a thick finger at the cast-iron stove. "Beans are soaked, meat's on the hook. Fire needs tending." He didn't ask her to cook. He didn't offer a deal. He was stating the new reality. She was occupying space. She was consuming calories. She had to earn them. Nora looked at the heavy iron pot, then back at him. A flare of indignity sparked in her chest. She had been left to die, dragged through the snow, and now she was a scullery maid to a savage. She opened her mouth to argue, to demand he take her somewhere, to a fort, to a town, but she looked at his eyes. Cold, flat, pragmatic. If she refused, he wouldn't beat her. He would simply open the door and point to the snow. He had saved her because it was mildly less effort than stepping over her corpse. But he wouldn't keep her if she was useless. The fire popped loudly in the silence. Nora swallowed her pride. It tasted like ash. She limped over to the stove. She picked up the heavy iron poker, her bruised fingers protesting, and jabbed at the glowing coals. "Where is the salt?" she asked quietly. Judd didn't smile, but the tight line of his jaw relaxed a fraction of an inch. He walked over to a high shelf and pulled down a small wooden box, tossing it onto the table. "Don't waste it," he said. That was the beginning. There was no proposal, no romance, just the quiet, desperate exchange of labor for warmth. Nora cooked his meals, washed his blood-stained clothes in boiling water that burned her hands, and swept the dirt floor. Judd hunted, chopped wood, and kept the brutal winter at bay. They lived in a tense, claustrophobic orbit. Nora learned to read his silences. A heavy sigh meant the traps were empty. A short grunt meant the meat was tough. She learned the smell of him, wood smoke, sweat, and cold air. She hated him for his lack of pity, yet she found herself watching him when he sat by the fire, fascinated by the scars on his hands, wondering what had driven a man so far away from the world that he preferred the company of wolves. One night, the wind howling around the cabin like a dying animal, Nora was shivering on her cot. The fire had burned low. She pulled the thin blanket tight, her teeth chattering. She heard the rustle of husks from Judd's bed across the room. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor. Nora stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. He stood over her in the dark. She braced herself, expecting rough hands, expecting the payment for the food and the roof. Instead, a heavy, suffocating weight fell over her. It smelled strongly of animal fat and wildness. He had thrown his massive bearskin coat over her blanket. "Keep the fire stoked," he muttered gruffly, turning back to his bed. Nora lay frozen under the heavy hide. It was incredibly warm. She pressed her face into the rough fur, inhaling the scent of the man who had dragged her from the grave. A strange, confusing knot tightened in her chest. It wasn't gratitude. It certainly wasn't love. It was something rougher, something born of the dirt and the cold. She was his, not by law, not by God, but by the brutal, undeniable law of the mountain. And as the wind screamed against the logs, Nora closed her eyes, clutching the bearskin tightly, realizing with a dark, cynical comfort that she finally belonged to someone who wouldn't leave her behind to starve. November bled into December, not with a change on a calendar, but with a thickening of the ice on the inside of the window panes. The world shrank to 20 square feet of packed dirt floor, log walls weeping frozen sap, and the suffocating heat of the iron stove. The routine became a religion. Wake before the sun. Break the skim of ice in the water bucket with the handle of a heavy iron ladle. Stoke the dying embers. Fry salt pork until the fat rendered into a clear, smoking pool. Boil the bitter coffee. Nora moved through these chores with a dull, bruised efficiency. The limp in her left leg remained, a permanent souvenir of the frost, acting up fiercely when the barometric pressure dropped. Judd never commented on it. He simply expected the coffee to be hot when he returned from the timber. They existed in a state of suspended hostility. Judd was not a cruel man by nature, but he was deeply, fundamentally untamed. He ate with his hands. He smelled of animal musk and old sweat. He cleaned his firearms at the table, leaving oily patches on the rough wood that Nora had to scrub with lye soap that cracked her knuckles. The claustrophobia was a physical weight. Nora found herself staring at the back of his neck as he sat by the fire, a sudden, irrational urge to strike him with the fire poker surging through her. It wasn't because he mistreated her. It was because he didn't care if she was there or not. She was a ghost hauling water. The rupture happened on a Tuesday. Judd had brought in a fresh deer carcass 2 days prior, stringing it up in the small, freezing lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. The meat needed to be cut, salted, and packed into the barrel before it froze solid. "Get the haunch," Judd ordered, tossing a heavy cleaver onto the table. "Cut it small. Don't waste the fat." Nora wrapped her thin shawl tighter. She stepped into the lean-to. The air was vicious, biting through her cotton dress instantly. She grabbed the heavy, stiff leg of venison. It was slick with frozen blood and heavy as a boulder. She heaved it off the iron hook. Her bad leg buckled. She pitched sideways. The venison slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the dirt floor with a heavy, dead thud. It rolled, coating the exposed meat in a thick layer of loose dirt, wood shavings, and dog hair. Nora froze, her breath catching in her throat. The cabin door opened. Judd filled the frame. He looked at her on her knees, then at the ruined meat. The silence stretched. It was worse than yelling. "I slipped," Nora said, her voice sounding entirely too loud, too defensive. She scrambled to pick up the heavy chunk of meat, but her hands were trembling violently. "I can wash it. I'll cut the dirty parts off." Judd walked forward. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He looked down at the venison. "That's 3 days of food," he said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble. "I said I'll wash it!" Nora snapped. The sudden flare of anger surprised her. It boiled up from the pit of her stomach, fueled by weeks of silence and scrubbing and freezing. "I'm not a pack mule. I have a bad leg. You know I have a bad leg." Judd's pale eyes locked onto hers. The flat, dead stare was gone, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. "I know," he said softly. "The mountain don't care about your leg." He reached down, grabbed the haunch by the bone, and hauled it up. He carried it to the table inside and threw it down. "You don't wash it," he commanded. "Water freezes, ruins the cure. You scrape it, every speck of dirt. Then you salt it. And when we eat it, if there's grit in my teeth, you don't eat." He turned and walked out the front door, whistling sharply for Brutus. Nora stood in the freezing lean-to, her chest heaving. Hot tears of absolute fury pricked her eyes. She wanted to scream at his back. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run. The arithmetic hadn't changed. She walked back into the cabin, picked up a small paring knife, and sat at the table. For 3 hours, she painstakingly scraped dirt and hair from the freezing flesh. Her fingers bled. Her back screamed. She didn't cry. The cynical, hardened core that had kept her alive under the spruce tree solidified a little more. She scraped the meat until it was raw and clean, hating the mountain, hating the winter, and hating him most of all. The blizzard hit 3 weeks later. It was a whiteout, the wind shrieking through the pines with the sound of tearing metal. Judd had gone out to check the upper trap line before the sky turned the color of bruised iron. He should have been back by noon. By dusk, Nora was pacing. She told herself she didn't care. If he froze, she had the cabin. She had the salted meat, the firewood, the rifle. She could survive until the thaw. "Liar." A small, cold voice whispered in her head. She didn't know how to track. She didn't know how to butcher a large animal. If the wood ran out, she couldn't swing the heavy axe well enough to fell a tree. She was a parasite on his survival. If the host died, she died. She threw another log into the stove. The flames roared, but the corners of the room remained stubbornly dark and freezing. A heavy, wet thump hit the thick timber of the front door. Nora jumped, dropping the iron poker. Brutus, who had been huddled nervously by the fire, let out a low, structural growl. Another thump, a scrape. Nora grabbed the heavy Henry rifle from the table. She didn't know how to aim it properly, but she knew how to pull the lever and squeeze the trigger. She backed away from the door, raising the heavy barrel. The latch clicked. The door was pushed open, catching the wind. Snow blasted into the room, instantly killing the heat. Judd stumbled over the threshold. He didn't look like the immovable mountain she knew. He was bent double. His heavy bearskin coat was soaked black on the right side. He took one step, his boot leaving a thick, dark smear of crimson on the floorboards, and collapsed. He hit the floor like a felled oak. Brutus whined, nudging Judd's face with his snout. Nora lowered the rifle. The metallic smell of fresh blood cut through the wood smoke. It was a heavy, coppery stench. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She stood frozen for 2 full seconds. He's dead. Then Judd groaned. It was a wet, ragged sound. Nora dropped the rifle. She rushed forward, fighting the wind to shove the heavy door shut, dropping the iron bar into place. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by Judd's shallow, wheezing breath. She fell to her knees beside him. Judd. Judson. He didn't open his eyes. His skin was the color of old ash, clammy and freezing to the touch. She grabbed the collar of his coat and pulled. It was too heavy. "Help me," she hissed, though there was no one to hear. She dragged him by the shoulders, her boots slipping in his blood, hauling him inch by agonizing inch toward the heat of the stove. Her bad hip screamed, but she ignored it. She grabbed her sewing scissors from the shelf. She didn't bother trying to unbutton his frozen, blood-caked canvas trousers. She jammed the lower blade in at the cuff and ripped upward. The thick fabric parted, revealing his right thigh. Nora gagged. It wasn't a clean cut. It was a jagged, horrific tear, deep enough to expose the pale gleam of the femur. A branch. A deadfall trap had snapped, or a falling limb had impaled him. Muscle and fat bulged obscenely from the wound. Dark blood pulsed out in a sluggish, steady rhythm. She had to stop the bleeding. She scrambled to the fire, grabbing a clean cotton rag she used for drying dishes. She balled it up, crawled back to him, and shoved it directly into the gaping meat of his leg. Judd's eyes flew open. He didn't scream. His jaw locked, the muscles in his neck cording like thick ropes. His hand lashed out, grabbing Nora's wrist with a grip that felt like a steel vice. "Hold it!" she barked, her voice cracking. She didn't pull away. She leaned all her weight onto her hands, pressing the rag deeper into the wound. "You're bleeding out." His chest heaved. The grip on her wrist slowly loosened. His head fell back against the floorboards. "Needle," he rasped. Nora looked at the wound. It was massive. "I can't. It's too deep. I don't—" "Needle," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Or I rot." Nora stared at his pale face. The power dynamic of the cabin had completely inverted in the space of 10 minutes. He was helpless. The man who had dragged her from the snow was bleeding to death on her floor. She could simply lift her hands. The bleeding would resume. He would fade. She would have the cabin. The thought was there. Dark, pragmatic, and entirely a product of the mountain. She looked down at her hands, stained red up to the wrists. She remembered the fire burning her frozen fingers, and his massive hand holding her down so she wouldn't break herself thrashing. She maintained the pressure with one hand, leaning her knee into his leg to keep it steady. With her free hand, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small wooden cylinder. Inside was a thick bone needle and a spool of coarse, waxed linen thread, used for mending canvas tents, not human flesh. "This is going to be bad," she said. Her voice was flat. She was mirroring him. Judd closed his eyes. "Do it." Nora poured cheap, burning corn whiskey from a jug over his leg and her hands. Judd flinched violently, but made no sound. She threaded the needle. Her hands were shaking so badly she missed the eye 3 times. She pinched the edges of the ragged skin together. They were cold and tough, like old leather. She pushed the needle in. It didn't want to go. Human skin is remarkably resilient. She had to force it, driving the blunt bone through the meat. Judd's breath hissed sharply through his teeth. "Sorry," she whispered automatically. He didn't answer. She stitched for an hour. The smell of the whiskey and the blood made her light-headed. 14 rough, ugly knots holding the disaster of his leg together. When she finally tied off the last stitch, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. Judd was unconscious again. Nora fetched water, washing the blood from his leg and the floor. She dragged his mattress closer to the fire and, with a massive effort, rolled him onto it. She piled every blanket they owned over him, including the heavy bear skin. She sat in the wooden chair next to the stove, her bloody hands resting in her lap, watching his chest rise and fall. The wind outside howled, but inside, the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a cage. It was the silence of a ward. The fever took him on the second day. Judd tossed and muttered under the heavy furs, his skin radiating a dry, intense heat. Nora barely slept. She boiled snow for water, dripping it between his cracked lips. She crushed dried willow bark and forced the bitter paste down his throat. He was a terrible patient. Even in his delirium, he was combative. When she tried to wipe the sweat from his forehead, he would swat her hand away with surprising force, muttering disjointed, angry phrases. "Leave the line. Wolves got the scent." Damn it all. Nora learned to move quickly, darting in with a cool cloth and retreating before he could strike. She watched the ugly, puckered stitches on his leg like a hawk, terrified of the red, angry streaks of infection. She washed the wound daily with boiled water and the last of the whiskey. By the 5th day, the wood box was nearly empty. Nora stared at the few remaining logs. The fire was the only thing keeping the cabin from becoming a meat locker. She put on Judd's spare canvas coat. It swallowed her completely and wrapped her head in her wool shawl. She stepped outside. The cold was a physical wall. The snow was thigh-deep, sparkling blindingly in the crisp, indifferent winter sun. The chopping block was buried. She found the heavy splitting maul resting against the side of the cabin. She dragged a thick round of pine onto the block. She lifted the maul. It was incredibly heavy, throwing her center of gravity entirely off. She swung. The heavy iron head struck the very edge of the log, glancing off and burying itself deep in the frozen dirt, inches from her boot. The shockwave rattled up her arms, vibrating deep in her teeth. Nora cursed loudly, a foul word she had heard her father use when the wagon wheel broke. She wrenched the maul free. She swung again. This time it hit dead center, but she didn't have enough velocity. The blade bit in an inch and stuck fast. She spent 10 minutes wrestling the maul free, panting, sweat freezing to her eyelashes. She was useless. The arithmetic was proving true again. She swung a third time, fueled purely by frustration. The wood cracked, but didn't split. "You're choking the handle." Nora jumped, dropping the maul. Judd was leaning against the doorframe of the cabin. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his beard matted with sweat. He was wearing only his long johns and one boot, holding himself upright by gripping the rough timber of the frame. "You shouldn't be up," Nora snapped, her embarrassment flaring into anger. Judd ignored her. He limped heavily forward, his jaw tight with pain. He stopped in front of the chopping block. He reached down and picked up the maul with one hand. "Right hand near the head when you lift," he rasped, his voice weak but instructive. "Slide it down to meet the left when you swing. Let the iron do the work. You ain't strong enough to force it." He didn't demonstrate. He couldn't swing it in his condition. He just held it out to her. Nora looked at him. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a tired, practical instruction. She took the handle. Their bare hands brushed. His skin was incredibly hot from the lingering fever, rough as sandpaper. The contact sent a strange, electric jolt up her arm. She didn't pull away immediately. Neither did he. He looked down at her hands. The knuckles were raw, the skin split from the cold and the washing. "Your hands are bleeding," he said quietly. "I'm fine," Nora said, finally pulling her hands back, adjusting her grip on the maul. Judd didn't retreat to the cabin. He stood there, leaning heavily on his good leg, watching her. Nora approached the log. She gripped the maul the way he said. Right hand high, left hand low. She lifted it over her head, feeling the weight differently this time. As she swung, she slid her right hand down the smooth hickory handle. Thwack! The maul bit deep. The wood groaned. It didn't split cleanly, but it cracked all the way through. "Better!" Judd grunted. They stayed like that for half an hour. Nora chopping, struggling, learning the rhythm of the heavy iron. Judd watching, offering a sparse, quiet correction every few swings. When she finally had an armful of jagged, uneven firewood, she turned back to the cabin. Judd had already gone inside, sitting heavily in the chair by the stove, his breathing ragged from the exertion of just standing. Nora dumped the wood into the box. She turned to him. He was shivering, the sweat chilling on his pale skin. Without thinking, she picked up the heavy bearskin coat from his cot. She walked over to him and draped it over his shoulders. Judd looked up at her. The distance that had defined their existence for 2 months was gone, burned away by the fever and the blood. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. His voice was a low gravel drag. "Do what?" Nora asked, kneeling to open the stove door. "Stitch me." Nora paused, a piece of pine in her hand. She looked at the flames. She thought about the answer. "Because I need you to survive. Because I was afraid." She looked back at him. "Because you pulled me out of the snow," she said, her voice steady. "I pay my debts." Judd held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, a small, genuine smile cracked the hard lines of his face. It changed him entirely, making him look younger, softer. "You owe me a hell of a lot of firewood, then," he said. Nora didn't smile back, but the tight, defensive knot in her chest finally loosened. "I'll chop it tomorrow," she said, closing the stove door. "Go back to bed, Judd." He didn't argue. He pulled the bearskin tighter and limped back to his cot. As Nora swept the wood chips from the floor, she listened to the rhythm of his breathing. The cabin was still a cage, and the winter outside was still a killer. But the silence inside had changed. They were no longer 2 animals circling each other in a trap. They were a pack of 2, waiting for the spring. February did not arrive. It settled like a stone on the chest. The wood smoke in the cabin no longer smelled of fresh pine. It smelled of stale ash and the suffocating musk of 2 unwashed bodies trapped in a 10 by 10 box. The cold outside was no longer an event. It was a permanent geologic feature. Judd's leg healed, but the mountain extracted its toll. The wound closed into an ugly, puckered ravine of purple scar tissue that drew his skin tight. He walked with a heavy, dragging limp, his boot scuffing the dirt floor in a maddening, repetitive rhythm. The silence between them had morphed. It was no longer the silence of a predator and prey. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of 2 draft animals pulling the same overloaded cart. The meat barrel was nearly empty. Nora stared into it one morning, the frost biting at her cheeks in the lean-to. Only a few hard, salt-crusted scraps of venison remained, resting beside a half-scoop of yellowed flour. She closed the lid. The sound was hollow. She walked back inside. Judd was sitting by the stove, sharpening his hunting knife on a wet stone. Shook, shook. The sound scraped against Nora's frayed nerves. 3 days, Nora said. Her voice was flat, raspy from a lingering cough she couldn't shake. Maybe 4, if we boil the bones again." Judd didn't stop sharpening the blade. He didn't look up. "I know. You can't walk the upper trap line," she said, her eyes dropping to his ruined thigh. "You can barely make it to the woodpile." Judd stopped. He slowly dragged the blade across the stone one last time, testing the edge with his thumb. A thin bead of red welled up on his calloused skin. He wiped it on his trousers. "Ain't your concern," he grunted. Nora crossed the small room in 3 strides. She snatched the whetstone out of his left hand and threw it onto the table. It hit the wood with a loud, sharp crack. Brutus whined from the corner. Judd looked up, his pale eyes flaring with a sudden, dangerous light. "It is my concern," Nora spat, her chest heaving. The cynical shell she had built cracked, revealing the raw, desperate terror underneath. "Because if you go out there and freeze in a snowbank because your leg gives out, I starve in here. We are tied together, Judd. You drag me down, I drag you down. So stop acting like you're the only one in this box." She stood over him, breathing hard, waiting for the backhand. She waited for him to put her in her place. Judd stared at her. His jaw worked, the muscles clenching beneath his thick, untamed beard. He looked at her thin face, the dark circles bruised under her eyes, the ragged clothes hanging off her shrinking frame. Slowly, the tension drained out of his shoulders. He leaned back in the chair, stretching his bad leg out with a wince. "Sit down, Nora," he said quietly. It was the first time he had used her name since the day she told it to him. It sounded strange in his mouth. Rough, like grinding pebbles. Nora didn't sit. She leaned against the table, crossing her arms to stop her hands from shaking. "The snow is too deep for the traps," Judd admitted, his voice a low rumble, devoid of his usual pride. "And the game is hunkered down. Nothing is moving. But there's a deadfall across the ridge. Set it in October for a bear. Might be a frozen carcass in it. Might be empty." "Can you make it?" she asked. "I have to." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a straight razor, its bone handle yellowed with age. He held it out to her. Nora frowned, looking at the blade. "What's that for?" "My beard," he said, gesturing to the thick, matted mess on his face. "It's freezing to my coat collar when I breathe. Pulls the skin open. You need to cut it off." Nora's breath caught. It was a request for an astonishing level of trust. A starving, desperate man handing a razor-sharp blade to a woman he had essentially held captive for months. She took the razor. The handle was warm from his pocket. Judd tipped his head back, exposing the thick column of his throat. He closed his eyes. Nora stepped between his knees. The smell of him was overwhelming. Wood smoke, cured leather, and the sour tang of old sweat. She poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup, working up a meager lather with a sliver of lye soap and her fingers. She rubbed it into his beard. The bristles were coarse, like iron wire. She unfolded the razor. Her hand trembled slightly. "Hold still," she murmured, echoing the words he had spoken to her when he thawed her hands. She laid the cold steel against his cheek. She scraped downward. The sound was loud in the quiet cabin, a harsh, tearing noise. She wiped the blade on a rag. Again, she worked in silence, her concentration absolute. As the heavy beard fell away, the man beneath was revealed. He wasn't a monster. He had a strong, square jaw, a chin scarred from an old burn, and a mouth pulled tight with chronic pain. Without the wild hair, he looked older, exhausted, and terrifyingly human. She moved to his throat. She had to press the fingers of her left hand lightly against his windpipe to pull the skin taut. She felt the slow, steady thump of his pulse beneath her fingertips. One slip, one sudden jerk of her wrist, and she could end him. Judd didn't flinch. His breathing remained deep and even. He trusted her, she finished, wiping the remaining soap from his face with a damp rag. She stepped back, folding the razor. Judd opened his eyes. He rubbed his bare jaw, the skin pale and sensitive in the firelight. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to the razor in her hand, then back to her eyes. "You got a steady hand," he noted. Nora set the razor on the table. "Don't die on the ridge, Judd." He stood up, grabbing his heavy canvas coat. "Keep the fire hot." He was gone for 2 days. The arithmetic of starvation is brutal. It begins with a dull ache, transitioning into sharp, hollow cramps that double you over. Then the pain recedes, replaced by a floating, terrifying weakness. Your vision narrows. The cold seeps into your marrow, impossible to banish, no matter how close you sit to the stove. On the evening of the 2nd day, Nora boiled the last strip of leather from an old saddle strap, chewing the softened hide until her jaw ached, swallowing the bitter juices just to put something in her stomach. She sat by the window, the Henry rifle across her lap. If he didn't return by morning, she would have to eat the dog. She looked at Brutus, asleep by the stove. The dog opened one yellow eye, looking back at her. He knew. A sharp, high-pitched yelp tore through the howling wind outside. Nora bolted upright. The world spun dizzily, black spots dancing in her vision. She gripped the windowsill to steady herself. Brutus was on his feet, the hair on his back standing up in a stiff ridge. He let out a deep, booming bark, scratching frantically at the heavy timber door. Nora grabbed the rifle. She unbarred the door and cracked it open. The wind nearly ripped it from her grasp. The snow was falling in heavy, wet sheets, the sky a bruised twilight purple. 30 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the tree line, a dark mass was thrashing in the snow. It was Judd. He was on his back, swinging his heavy rifle like a club. Surrounding him were 3 gaunt, grey shapes. Wolves. They weren't the massive, healthy timber wolves of autumn. These were starving, desperate things, driven mad by the same hunger ravaging the cabin. One lunged, its jaws snapping on Judd's canvas coat. Judd roared, a guttural sound of pure animal fury, smashing the wooden stock of his rifle into the wolf's ribs. The wood cracked loudly. Nora didn't think. The civilized girl who had been left behind on the trail was dead. She shoved the door open, stepping out into the freezing storm in her bare feet. The snow burned like hot coals against her skin. She raised the heavy Henry rifle to her shoulder. It was too heavy. The barrel swayed. She dropped to one knee, ignoring the agonizing spike of pain in her bad hip, resting her elbow on her knee to stabilize the weapon. She pulled the hammer back. Clack. She sighted down the barrel, aiming for the largest grey shape circling Judd's head. She didn't hold her breath. Her lungs were heaving too hard. She just waited for the shape to pause. The wolf stopped, dropping its head to tear at Judd's boot. Nora squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched her in the shoulder like a blacksmith's hammer. The explosion was deafening, a shockwave that temporarily silenced the wind. A 3-foot tongue of orange flame spat from the muzzle. The large wolf flipped backward, a spray of dark blood painting the white snow. It hit the ground thrashing, then lay still. The other 2 wolves scattered instantly, terrified by the thunder, vanishing into the heavy timber like smoke. Nora dropped the rifle. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees through the deep snow. "Judd!" He was trying to sit up, coughing violently. Blood smeared his face, though it wasn't clear if it was his or the wolf's. He looked at her, his eyes wild and unhinged for a fraction of a second before the brutal pragmatism returned. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't thank her. He pointed a shaking, blood-stained glove at the dead wolf. "Drag it inside," he wheezed, "before they come back for it." It took them 20 minutes. Judd couldn't stand. Nora had to haul him up by his belt, acting as a human crutch, while she dragged the heavy, bleeding carcass of the wolf by its hind legs with her other hand. When they finally collapsed through the cabin door, Nora barred it shut and slid to the floor, her chest heaving, her bare feet purple and numb. Judd lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, panting. He rolled his head to look at the dead predator bleeding onto the dirt floor. Then he looked at Nora. "You shoot straight," he managed to say, his voice cracking. "It was heavy," Nora whispered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Judd forced himself up onto his elbows. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt. He crawled toward the dead wolf. "Wait," Nora said, her stomach rolling violently. "You can't. It's a dog. It's—" Judd stopped. He looked at her, his pale eyes entirely stripped of humanity. He was a creature of the starving time. "It's meat," he stated flatly. "It's calories. You want to die holding on to your manners, you go lay in the snow. If you want to live, you fetch the iron pot." Nora stared at the blood pooling around the animal. She thought of her mother's fine china. She thought of the strict rules of the Sunday dinner table. Then she felt the agonizing, hollow scrape of her own stomach. She pushed herself off the floor. She limped to the stove. She grabbed the heavy iron pot. That night they ate boiled wolf meat. It was terrible, stringy, tough, and tasting overwhelmingly of copper and wild musk. Nora chewed rhythmically, tears streaming silently down her dirty face, not from sadness, but from the brutal, degrading reality of what it took to stay alive. Judd sat across from her. He reached out with a greasy hand and placed it over hers. He didn't offer comforting words. He just gripped her hand, his thumb pressing into her bruised knuckles. Nora didn't pull away. She squeezed back, grounding herself in the rough texture of his scars, accepting the dark communion they had just shared. The thaw did not come with a gentle spring breeze. It came with the violent, booming crack of river ice giving way. By mid-May, the snow had retreated, leaving behind a world of thick, black mud and blindingly green shoots of alpine grass. The cabin, which had felt like a tomb, now felt like a damp, rotting box. The smell of thawing earth poured through the open window, a scent so rich and alive it made Nora dizzy. They had survived. They were both changed. Nora was terrifyingly thin, her hands permanently calloused, her face weathered by wind and wood smoke. Her limp was pronounced on damp days, a permanent hitch in her step. Judd was quieter, his movements slower, the heavy limp in his right leg forcing him to use a thick walking stick carved from ash wood. The brutal edge of their survival had softened into a deeply ingrained routine. They didn't need to speak to communicate. A shift in Judd's shoulders meant he needed the rifle. A glance from Nora meant the coffee was boiling. One morning, Judd returned from the river. 3 large trout hanging from a stringer. He dropped them on the table. He didn't take off his coat. "Wagon train," he said. Nora stopped sweeping the dirt floor. The broom hovered in the air. "What?" "Down in the valley," Judd said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He didn't look at her. He stared out the window. 5, maybe 6 wagons, moving slow, heading west toward the California Trail. They'll pass the lower ridge by midday. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly loud. The outside world had finally breached the mountain. "The trail is clear," Judd continued, his voice devoid of emotion. It was the same tone he used to announce the wood was dry or the traps were empty. "Pass is open. Mud's deep, but passable." He set his coffee cup down. He walked over to his cot and reached underneath. He pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He set it on the table next to the trout. "Got a spare blanket in there," he said, listing the items with methodical detachment. "Flint and steel, 2 days of salted fish, and 5 gold eagles." Nora stared at the bag. The gold coins were a fortune. They were his trapping profits, the only currency he had for the trading post. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. "Severance," Judd said bluntly. "You paid your debt, Nora. Chopped the wood, kept the fire, stitched my leg. You're square. If you leave now, You can catch the wagons before they cross the river. You can buy passage west, find a town, find a husband who don't eat with his hands. He wasn't testing her. He wasn't playing a game. He was offering her the arithmetic of the civilized world. He knew he was a damaged, scarred man living in a dirt-floored hovel. He believed she deserved better. Nora looked at the canvas sack. She thought of the towns. She thought of clean dresses, mercantile stores, and polite conversation. She thought of her family, who had left her in the freezing mud because she slowed them down. She looked at Judd. He was leaning heavily on his ash stick, his pale eyes fixed stubbornly on the floorboards. He was bracing himself for her departure, shielding himself with the same cold detachment he used to survive the winter. Nora walked over to the table. She reached out and grabbed the canvas sack. Judd's jaw tightened. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "I'll saddle the horse. Save you the walk to the ridge." He turned toward the door. "Judd." He stopped, his hand on the heavy iron latch. Nora opened the canvas sack. She pulled out the folded wool blanket and tossed it onto his cot. She took the small leather pouch of gold coins and placed it on the high shelf above the stove, next to the salt box. "The roof on the lean-to needs patching," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "The snow rot ate through the crossbeams. If it rains, the firewood will soak." Judd didn't move. He stood frozen by the door, his broad shoulders perfectly still. Nora turned back to the table. She picked up her paring knife and grabbed the first trout. She slid the blade into the fish's belly, drawing it upward in a clean, practiced motion. "And I'm not eating fish without salt again," she continued, expertly gutting the trout. "So you'll need to go to the trading post next week. We need salt, flour, and coffee. Real coffee, not that chicory root garbage." Slowly Judd turned around. He looked at the unpacked bag, then at the gold on the shelf, and finally at Nora. She met his gaze. There were no tears. There were no sweeping declarations of love. They were two broken things that had grown together in the dark, their scars perfectly aligned. She wasn't staying out of gratitude. She was staying because the mountain had stripped away everything false in her life, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of the man standing in front of her. He hadn't left her behind. Judd stared at her for a long, silent minute. The hard, cynical lines of his face slowly unspooled. He let go of the door latch. He walked over to the table, leaning his ash stick against a chair. He reached out and took the bloody knife from her hand. He set it down. He wrapped his massive, scarred hands around her waist and pulled her against him. He smelled of river water, pine needles, and sweat. Nora buried her face in his chest, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. The embrace wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce, and grounding. It was the physical weight of an anchor dropping into solid rock. "Roof needs patching," Judd murmured into her hair, his voice thick and rough. "Yes," Nora whispered, closing her eyes against the warmth of his shoulder. "It does." The winter was dead, but in the deep timber, they had built something that the cold could never kill again. That's the unforgiving beauty of the untamed West, folks. Sometimes the monsters we fear turn out to be the only ones who will stand between us and the wolves. Nora didn't return to the world that threw her away. She built a new one out of blood, fire, and absolute loyalty. If this gritty tale of survival and dark romance kept you hooked, smash that like button, share it with someone who loves a real frontier story, and hit subscribe for more raw, unvarnished storytelling. Let me know in the comments, would you have taken the gold or stayed in the cabin? See you on the next trail.